Call Denise Roche.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to rise to take the first call on this, the third reading of the Local Government Auckland Transitional Provisions Amendment Bill. And I'm very pleased to do so because I am a resident of Auckland, and like all the speakers on this side of the House, we all have experienced local government in Auckland because we've actually lived there. And for myself, I've actually been involved in local government in Auckland as well. Like Tracy Martin from New Zealand First, I was a local board member after the amalgamation into the super city. Whereas the three speakers that we've had so far from this side of the House, National, none of them have yet. We have not yet had anybody from Auckland commenting on it. And I guess for me, other than to seek closure in previous parts of the bill. And I guess for me, that's sort of like a symbol of how the government actually responds to Auckland. There's a whole bunch of people who don't necessarily live there, who don't necessarily understand it, but who are attempting to make rules and to control the local government in that area. And they've done that consistently since they first came into office in 2008. So there's been 16 pieces of legislation since 2009, all of which have been a direct interference with local government in Auckland. And it's because Auckland is the powerhouse of the country that this government has, and I'm sorry if I've offended your sense of your own.
Don't bring me from Whanganui into it.
I'm sure Whanganui is a mighty city indeed. However, this is about Auckland, about 16 pieces of legislation about Auckland. Now, the interesting thing is that when the amalgamation happened way back in 2010, when it was finalised, there was this discussion about how it was going to be a savings in terms of for ratepayers and that. But actually, if you look at the legislation and what the legislation costs, it's been a shambles, and it's been a huge cost to taxpayers as well. This bill that we are currently discussing for the third reading, which has gone through urgency over the last 6 hours it will take before it is finally through, which has been a truncated process, that has actually cost the taxpayers of New Zealand just under $250,000. And that's because for every hour that the House sits, it costs $41,384. And so, if you times that by another 15 pieces of legislation, you're starting to get into millions, up to about $2.2 million there, just to meddle in the local government in Auckland. So we've been opposed to this bill because we see it as another attack on the democratic rights of local government to control their own decision making. And we were opposed to the original bill the original act that this bill amends. And we were opposed to it because it set in place, it gave the government the powers to determine who will be the hearings commissioners to hear the first Auckland unitary plan. Now, we know that we need a unitary plan. We know it is groundbreaking to get a unitary plan for a city that size. But we've also been very concerned at the truncated process that's been allowed for that very important piece of regulation that is being developed up in our biggest city in the country. Essentially, this government set in place timeframes that were not achievable, and they put that in the statutes. And so we've had to come back under urgency to pass legislation that not only, once more, gives the government the ability and right to appoint more hearings commissioners who will hear the submissions on the plan, but also enables them to get through another 5,000 site-specific submissions and report back by July next year. Now, the July next year period is purely arbitrary. And the fact that we went into urgency to do this is also completely unnecessary because, as we've heard from other speakers, there was the opportunity to have a truncated but democratic process to hear submissions on this bill, to hear from the experts, to hear personally from Auckland Council, We could have done that if we had have started the process at the time that the Minister actually announced that this is what was needed in the legislation in order for the recommendations to come back to the Council. So we are the only party in the House that is opposing this bill, and we take on board the fact that Auckland Council actually support it because they want to get through the unitary plan process too. But there were solutions that we'd offered right from the start. The development of the draft plan was a very democratic and consultative process run by Auckland Council. And at the time, we said, like many others in the House, that if we had have adopted that plan, the draft, then we could have gone on from there and we would have had more time. However, that was rejected by that side of the House. So we've taken a stand to oppose this bill because we are constantly concerned about the way this government will frequently decide and shortcut democracy in local government. And we've seen it time and time again in Auckland, but we've seen it elsewhere across the country. And I guess the classic one is the removal of the councillors, the Environment Canterbury councillors. And that was because they weren't playing ball, they weren't singing from the song sheet as the national government. And what did the government do there? They sacked the democratically elected representatives and they replaced them with their own hand-picked commissioners. We've had elections in Fiji before we've actually had elections for Environment Canterbury representatives. And it's been this consistent meddling with local government that really does disturb us. One of the absolute founding principles for the Greens is around appropriate decision making. And appropriate decision making means that decisions get made by the people who are affected by them. Now, in this case of ECAN, that has not happened. Basically, the people that they wanted to make the decisions have been dumped. And certainly, with the appointment of hearings commissioners, although it says in this bill that these extra hearings commissioners that the government, the ministers, will consult with the Statutory Māori Board, and they will consult with Auckland Council, it's a totally different thing from actually having the ability to make the decision or be part of the decision-making about who the council wants, who the elected representative wants, to be able to hear the submissions that will be coming through, that will be part of the framework and the documents that will set the rules for the development for the next 30 years of Auckland. We acknowledge the fact that those appointed commissioners have, by all accounts, been working incredibly hard and probably doing a really good job. But the process there, we worry about the process. We worry about the fact that the changes in this bill will mean that there'll be only two commissioners hearing submitters rather than three. We worry about the mistakes that this bill is actually fixing up and validating stuff that's happened before, and we worry about that because potentially we may make similar mistakes because we've been through this urgency process. So all in all, sir, we are opposing this bill, and we are the only ones in the House who will be, and we are doing it absolutely on a point of principle about democracy for Aucklanders.